Hey friends, welcome back. I have Harley Schlanger, the national spokesman for the LaRouche organization. We spoke with Harley back on July 1st, and he has some interesting developments to tell us about. Harley, welcome back.
Hi, Sean. How are you?
I'm great. I'm pleased to have you back. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. The situation is very, very different from when we talked a month ago.
It sounds like it, and in fact, I just want to share this with folks. You emailed me just the other day that you said, now that you're back in the States, you can tell me that there's been an interesting explosion of support for Glass-Steagall in Europe in the last few weeks, and it began, of all places, in the city of London, which, as all of these listeners know, is really the heart of darkness for the financial global cabal. And this awakening has been fueled by the crimes of the LIBOR, the HSBC drug money laundering revelations. Everybody's kind of waking up to the need for the immediate re-implementation of Glass-Steagall. Now, the question is, Harley, are the Congress people in this country going to wake up, and are they going to implement it?
Well, during the last couple of weeks of the last session, you had the Geithner appeared before the Congress, and again, he was treated, I think, far too mildly with kid gloves. They bought into his lies about that he took responsibility for LIBOR when he did nothing of the sort. He covered it up and he allowed it to continue. But what happened during this is a kind of Damascus Road conversion of Sanford Weill. When we talk about the heart of darkness in London, the Rothschilds and others, who, for their own survival, came out in the last 3 weeks for Glass-Steagall, now we see Sandy Weill, who, when he was putting together the mergers that created the mega bank, Citibank, he led the fight with Greenspan and others to repeal Glass-Steagall. And now Sandy Weill is saying we have to go back to Glass-Steagall. Now, his motives are different than yours or mine because he's primarily driven by how to make profit in banking. But nevertheless, during the hearings in the last week in Congress, when our organizers were very present, very visible, we had dozens of meetings with staffers, and during these meetings, congressmen and senators popped in, which is really quite unusual, and engaged in discussions, fairly serious discussions about Glass-Steagall. We're now up to, I think, 80 co-sponsors in H.R. 1489, which is the bill to restore Glass-Steagall. But during these hearings, the congressmen themselves brought up Sandy Weill's conversion. And then in the next days after that, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times both wrote editorials of a mea culpa type saying we were wrong, we need to go back to Glass-Steagall. So I think you could say on the surface, well, people are beginning to realize it was a mistake. It's much more profound than that. They're looking at the unraveling of hundreds of trillions of dollars of derivatives and then the credit default swap insurance policies on derivatives. And so it's not just that people are making measured decisions on policy. They're looking into the face of Armageddon, and some of them have blinked, including some people who are not very good people, but who are interested in the survival of their firms. So I think that's the main thing that's changed.
Yeah, and I have two questions for you. I'll ask you one and then the follow-up. The first one is, I think I just heard you say that even the Rothschild empire has come around to the idea for the need to re-implement Glass-Steagall. Is that correct? Is that what you discovered while you were in Europe?
Yes, there are people like Peter Hambrose of Hambrose Bank, which is part of the private bank network that's part of the Rothschilds. The Financial Times, which is a Rothschild-allied publication, was the first one to come out with discussion of the need to go back to Glass-Steagall. Lord Minor from the House of Lords, who has ties to these networks. And I think it's clear, when you're talking about the Rothschilds, you're talking about a bank that survived. Even though they're greedy and corrupt, they're also fairly clever, and that's how they've been able to survive. And it's very much like what happened in 1900 to 1903, when the British, who had been promoting free trade as the imperial policy for the last century, suddenly reversed themselves and went with a quasi-Hamiltonian protectionist policy. And the reason was not that they saw the light, it's that they saw that World War I was coming, and they needed an industrial buildup for the military in Britain. And so periodically you see these kinds of shifts which seem to be Damascus Road conversions or rejection of all previous ideology. And it's not that. It's survival. It's base survival. And so what we have to do, what American patriots have to do, is take this to get momentum, to get the right policy, but to make sure that in the process we don't let our guard down and assume that these are our new friends, and realize that the real issue here is ending this kind of imperial control over monetary policy that's characterized at least the last 45 years, and it became worse after the repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Well, you're right. Now, clearly these enemies of humanity are very shrewd, and they've been around for centuries. They own the central banks. They own this construct under which we live. And here's my follow-up question. As it relates to re-implementing Glass-Steagall, how will that help save the derivatives Ponzi, Harley? Because it seems to me that once that Ponzi begins to unravel, which it is, re-implementing Glass-Steagall isn't going to change it because the horses are already out of the gate. Glass-Steagall would have disallowed this from ever happening in the first place. How is putting Glass-Steagall back in place going to save this paradigm? And do we even want this paradigm to be saved?
Well, we don't want the paradigm to be saved, but I don't think they're trying to save the paradigm. They're trying to save their own ass. I mean, we're really looking at a situation where the rats are jumping off the sinking ship. And I think with some of these banks, some of these bankers, Sandy Weil and others, they're basically saying that this paradigm has failed. They're recognizing that. Now, they're not about to go to a reverse paradigm, namely one of national banking, of regulation, of shutting down derivative speculation, and so on. They're not going to accept that. But they're willing to write off some of the losses for themselves to be able to survive. Now, our approach has to be different. The problem with the paradigm is that you didn't have derivatives for much of the period of the last 100 years. When the imperial monetary policies dominated. Derivatives are a relatively modern form of so-called financial innovation. But they still wish to have their private banks control governments. And what we're seeing in Europe now, which is I think we're in the last months of this fight over the euro because it's going to be settled one way or the other in the very near future. Because what's happened in Europe is the amount of debt is growing faster than the ability to bail it out. They don't have enough bailout mechanisms or enough suckers to put in money to keep this Ponzi scheme going. And so the question is, will they try and keep it going by destroying nations, by shattering any semblance of national sovereignty, which is what people like Mario Draghi of the European Central Bank is demanding, which is what's coming out of Van Rompuy, the president of the European Union, and others. They're saying nations have to give up sovereignty and make themselves subservient completely to the needs of the banks. That's the direction that Europe is going. But even that won't succeed. And so the problem in Europe is that nationalism in Europe has been given a bad name. And these countries are watching themselves be destroyed, and they're being told, if you go back to national protection, then you're somehow going back to the paradigm that created World War I and World War II, which is a lie. Now, the advantage we have is that American patriotism and American sovereignty is known by most people as the strength of our country. And so they've been chiseling away at that in a covert way for the most part. But now, again, it's becoming clear. For example, the LIBOR. What is LIBOR about? Essentially, you had a group of banks that initially were using the rigging of interest rates to make their banks look more sound than they were. But at a certain point, they realized, hey, we can use this. The bankers who were setting the interest rates were then passing that information on to the investment side of the banks, who were then able to use knowing where the rates were going to go to craft so-called risk management instruments that would benefit the investment banks. And so you had a perfect example of what Glass-Steagall would do. Glass-Steagall would make it illegal for commercial banks and investment banks to coexist as a universal bank, which would mean the insider information that was passed on would become a crime. Now, it should be a crime anyway. Geithner should be in prison. Bernanke, who facilitated this, Obama, who oversaw this. These are people who committed crimes against the United States. So Glass-Steagall would stop this. It would stop the potential for future derivative operations. And Sean, one point on this that people don't understand. They say, well, how would Glass-Steagall have stopped Lehman? Lehman was an investment bank, so Glass-Steagall wouldn't have even applied. Well, with Glass-Steagall, you would not have had the banks generating the volume of liquidity and leverage that was necessary for the investment banks to run these schemes that got them so deeply in debt, with Lehman 30 to 40 to 1 leverage ratings. That couldn't have happened. And then if you also would not have had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac backing up the mortgage security bubble, it wouldn't have happened. So return to some sound basic banking principles would be the first step, but you have to do it with a government enforcement. And I'll just say one other thing, because when I'm in Austria a lot, people say, well, we're Austrian school, we're against any government involvement. And one of the points I made to them is that the strength of the United States is that when the American people are alert to what's actually happening, they're making the government the instrument of the needs of the people. It's when the people don't take responsibility and let the Congress be bought by the banks and the financial institutions and insurance companies and oil companies, then the government becomes a captive of the corporate cartels. And that's a huge difference. So our job has to be to make government an instrument of self-government of people rather than the enforcement arm of private financial interests.
Can I circle back and ask you a question? Is there infighting amongst this global cabal? Because, you note that Van Rompuy and Draghi, who is a Goldman agent, has been put in place in Greece by Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is clearly one of the part owner of the Federal Reserve central bank system here in this country. There must be infighting between these parties. If you're saying the Rothschilds and others want Glass-Steagall implemented so they can save themselves from catastrophe, others are saying, no, more of the same. What accounts for this infighting?
Well, again, it's rats leaving a sinking ship versus rats who are saying we've got to stay on the ship and keep it afloat. Goldman Sachs, as you mentioned, is one of the key agencies in this whole European crisis. The dictator of Italy right now, Mario Monti, who was never elected, is not a member of a party. He's a technocratic dictator appointed by Brussels, is a former Goldman Sachs guy. Draghi was the head of Goldman Sachs Europe at the beginning of 2000 to 2005. And you have Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, the leading banks essentially created the European Union under the direction of a man named Robert Mundell, who said that the European Union must serve as a way of destroying national sovereignty. The whole point of the euro was not what most people think, that you're going to set up a single currency and do away with borders. It was an instrument to attack sovereignty. And so you have a grouping of these bankers who have essentially decided that, as in the words of Louis XIV, après nous le déluge. If we can't win, we don't care if the whole thing goes down in a flood or a crash. But you have others, and this is where the Rothschilds come in. This is where Peter Hambros comes in. This is where perhaps some of the people inside the Financial Times and even Der Spiegel, the German publication, the Time magazine of Germany, came out with a very strong endorsement of Glass-Steagall the other day. What they're saying is that if we lose nations, then we lose the ability of our banks to make money. And so you might say there's a more realistic faction among some of these criminals who are willing to give up some of their gains in the short term to survive, and then in fact use that as a weapon against some of the other totally crazy ones who are saying, no, we can't pull back from this. So there is a lot of infighting. It's absolutely right.
Thanks for watching Part 1. Don't miss Part 2, and be sure to visit sgtreport.com for all of my original content and the most important daily news. Together we can take liberty back, and check out my new website, thelibertymill.com. Real news, 24/7. Thanks for watching.